Well, thank you, Michael, and good morning, Chautauqua. Happy 4th of July. I think it's extremely generous of you to invite an Englishman to speak on this of all days. I was a young student in Philadelphia, had just arrived in this country in 1976, and the bicentennial came. And I remember going down on the 4th of July to the Liberty Bell. And guess who was there? Not only the mayor, not only American dignitaries, but the Queen of England. And I thought maybe she would offer a pardon. But instead, she just said how happy that now we are friends. The following day, my two brothers and I got into my battered old 1965 Chevy Impala, and we drove over the next 4 weeks around the country and finished up in California. And we finally went to 48 states in that Chevy Impala. And as I went around, the feeling that I got on that 4th of July of total inspiration just grew and grew and grew. And 48 years later, 2 months from now, my wife Lisbeth and I will become American citizens. So thank you. Although we still have to take the exam, which apparently is not very easy. So look, I mean, it is incredible to think about 248 years ago today, the 56 members of the Second Continental Congress agreed the language of the Declaration of Independence. It had not been easy. Thomas Jefferson, as you know, had written it a couple of weeks earlier. There were 86 changes to it. Blame some of the John Adams was there, Benjamin Franklin, and then they all reviewed it for a couple of days. And Thomas Jefferson wasn't so happy with some of the changes. But the point is, the main idea which changed everything was this statement of 55 words only. It's hard to think of 55 words that humans have ever written that have had a bigger impact than this. That all people have inalienable rights, and that governments exist to serve those people, and they stand with the authority of those people. And it's so obvious that we hold these truths to be self-evident. And you think about the impact of that. In those days, there were no democratic elections. This year, 4.2 billion people in the world will be voting democratically, all standing in the tradition of those 55 words. And the most important election is going on today, as you may know. If the government chooses when an election was, if I were the government of the UK, I would not pick the 4th of July if I wanted to win. And sure enough, he won't win. By midnight tonight, they will know who has won. By lunchtime tomorrow, his entire family and all his possessions will have left number 10 Downing Street. And by tea time tomorrow, the new Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, will be there with his family, and all of his furniture will already be moved in. And by this time tomorrow, the new government will be in full operation. How about that, eh? So what we're discussing this week is technology. And the world's history is basically defined by amazing technological changes, whether it's discovering fire nearly a million years ago, or at least controlling fire a million years ago, the wheel at 5000 BC, the writing system at 3500 BC, and a whole set of issues, the discovery, the invention of paper, the printing press 600 years ago, the steel plow changed agriculture. So too, the electric light bulb, just 5 years after the first Chautauqua meeting, the electric light bulb changed everything. And so too we see a whole series of automobiles, aeroplanes, and 50 years ago, this very year, the invention of the personal computer, which launched the entire digital revolution. And of course, AI stands in this amazing tradition. And people say, well, is AI as important as controlling fire? Or maybe it's as important as the invention of the printing press. We don't know, but we know it's pretty important. And like these other discoveries which have created these little kinks in history, so too AI. Now, important to say, as we've been saying this week, technology doesn't always improve everything. If you study growth theory at university, you know that the only way of growing over time is by growing population and improving technology. So we do need technological progress, but actually it doesn't necessarily improve it for everyone. Let me give you an example. Between 1000 and 1300, the biggest invention was actually the watermill and the use of windmills. It doubled yields throughout Europe. It was incredible. Do you think the poor benefited? No, they didn't. Actually, they suffered as a result of that. Do you know who benefited? It was actually the church. And do you know why we have so many Gothic cathedrals now? Because of watermills and windmills. Incredible. Why? Because they had the power. They controlled 1/3 of all the agricultural land in England. Same thing happens when you look at the Industrial Revolution. The spinning jenny transformed the way the textile industry was going to develop. Do you think the poor who'd been doing the spinning themselves benefited? Not at all, I'm afraid. Rather, they became unemployed. They were sucked into the cities. And for the first 75 years of the Industrial Revolution, from 1776 to 1850, the poor actually got poorer, whilst the rich got a lot richer. For the second half of the 19th century, the poor benefited a lot because by that stage, there was legislation coming into being, both in Europe and in the United States, and it was a shared prosperity. Now, what's the point of the story? The point of the story is, as we embrace new technologies, we have to think about how they are governed. A wonderful book came out last year by two distinguished MIT economists called Power and Progress. And they look at 1,000 years of technological progress, and they ask, under what conditions will this benefit people, and under what conditions will it simply reinforce existing power structures? Now look, the technology we're talking about over time has transformed everything. Since it's the 4th of July, it's worth remembering, in this country, when the Declaration of Independence was agreed, the average lifespan was less than 30. It's now 77. Amazing gift from God in terms of nutrition, in terms of health, technological progress. So too, more recently, incredible progress. Never in the history of the world have we seen a reduction in poverty like we have seen in the last 50 years. When I was a teenager, 70% of the world's population was extremely poor. Now less than 9% are. So it's a wonderful gift from God that we receive technological progress. The problem is, as we grow, which is a terrific thing to do, that growth is imposing pressures on the natural world. In the 20th century, that's the century we just left, the world economy grew 20 times. That means all of the materials we extract, all the manufacturing, the consumption, the waste, grew 20 times. And you know, this century, if we keep growing at 3% a year, if you compound that for 100 years, it will be another 20 times. So that's 20 times times 20 times, that's 400 times. So from 1900 to 2100, the human footprint, the scope of the human imprint upon the world, 400 times as much. And so we started with this little footprint, and this is what we are now. And this, in a way, is the sort of the reason we have to worry about nature. There's lots of analysis now that show what is the human footprint. All the parts there that are in red or orange, that's where there are no real wildlands left at all. And what we're seeing is, over the last 50 years, as human beings have doubled in population. If you look at the populations of all the other vertebrates combined, they have fallen by half. One species doubles, all the other species fall by half. And of course, as we expand like this, we obviously put out a lot of pollution. This is carbon intensity in the atmosphere, and you see this goes back 800,000 years, and you see what's happened just in the last few years, and it's still going up. And so that's why we care about climate change. And of course, we now know, the scientists tell us, that that leads to hotter temperatures. And if you look here, these are the annual temperatures over the last, since 1940. 21 of the hottest 23 years ever recorded have been this century. So things are getting warmer, and it's not just the land and the air, it's the sea as well. And of course, because the sea gets warmer, that's why you have stronger hurricanes. This is this week. There's never been a hurricane as strong as this in the Caribbean today, at this time in the year ever before in history. And we know why. So there's rising seas, of course. We have worsening floods, longer droughts. These are all caused. And the estimate is that there is probably 100 million people, if this continues, that will be driven into poverty because of these things. So if we care about God's natural creation, we have to worry about this. Now, we believe, as you do, there is a better way. We cannot afford not to have progress. There are 700 million people in the world still don't have electricity. There are 800 million people in the world who go to bed hungry every night. And so there is a better way, and we're starting to see some wonderful progress. As we need to move towards renewable energy, the cost of batteries have fallen by nearly 80% in the last 10 years. And so too, wind energy, solar energy, it's fallen a lot. And so we're seeing some really good progress, and we're seeing a lot of uptake as well. So this you'll see is wind generation, solar generation, battery storage. The problem is, even although we're making this progress, which is very, very exciting, it is nowhere near enough to address the problem. So in a way, it's a bit like this. We're the dog, and we're chasing the scooter. And we're going faster and faster. We're inventing new things. We've got solar energy. We've got lots of great things. The problem is, the problem is going faster and faster. And the dog can run faster and faster, but it'll never catch up unless it gets its own scooter. And this is where AI comes in. Maybe AI is that scooter. And it's worth remembering what AI actually does. We've had some of this in the last few days. What AI can do, and it's just a tool to help make things quicker and faster and more effective. It can absorb huge amounts of data that human beings never can, and it can synthesize this. It can automate monitoring. We can measure every single tree in the world, and there are 3 trillion of them, by the way. Every single species in the world. It can optimize solutions, build predictive models. It can develop digital twins. A digital twin is a model that's based upon an incredible amount of data. Indeed, we're going to be discussing tomorrow precisely that for the lake out here. If you really collect enough data, you can build an entire computer model, and then you can try things out on it. So you can make decisions informed by the digital twin, and it can accelerate discovery. It can develop new processes. So this is what we are looking for. As Michael said, we have just launched a grand challenge, and we're saying to those on the front line, if you're trying to protect nature, if you're worried about, river pollution, please apply, and we will match you up with the AI experts around the world. And we've done a major piece of work with Columbia University and the University of Albany to assess what are the prospects. And it's very exciting indeed. Now, but it is important to say that actually, in addition to that, there are problems we have to worry about. The biggest that people talk about is that AI and servers use an incredible amount of electricity. By 2026, most of us don't know what 1,000 terawatts are, but if you envisage this is the amount of the total electricity consumption of Japan, That's how much is going to be needed just for servers by 2026, and it's still growing. And some people are worried about that a lot. Others, like Bill Gates, who we were with last week in London, he says, look, you know, yes, it's a lot of energy, but at the same time, AI will help us develop more renewable energy, so don't worry too much about it. I want to give you just 3 examples of how AI can potentially really help in the space of nature and climate change. And one is just monitoring and protecting biodiversity. That's the number of species, if you like. There are 8.5 million species. We know possibly up to 40 million. So far, only 1.8 million have been actually described. We are losing species more rapidly than we are identifying them. So what AI can do, using its powers of visual and sound and DNA recognition, it will be able to massively speed up the pace at which we identify new species, but also we monitor existing ones. So a very simple example, AI can track individual animals because every animal has something unique about it. Humans could never do this on their own. AI, using its massive databases, can trace individual leopards, for example. And so too, if you think about, you know, down below the sea, we don't know much about what goes on down there. But it turns out there's something called eDNA. And that is when a fish or any species swims through water, it leaves part of its DNA. That DNA can be analyzed, and using massive databases of DNA of all other species, AI can help identify, is this an existing one? Is this a new one? And we can monitor and count. Let me give you another, what you might think is a silly example, but it's not. This is not a friendly person. It's a Burmese python, and some crazy person 20 years ago released some pet pythons into the Florida Everglades. There now are an estimated 300,000 of these, and they are hungry, and they are decimating the other creatures that are there. So they have traps all around the Everglades to try and catch them. The problem is the traps are catching all the other animals because they can't tell the difference. What AI can do is it can spot exactly what species it is, and it can trap the ones. That's a small example, but much bigger examples. Every day, trillions of data points are coming off satellites, and humans could never analyze them all. And what you can see if you look here, this is Papua New Guinea. You see this is deforestation as roads are built, and then that's a big palm oil plantation on the right. So this is accessible to everybody. If you're a ranger, you know exactly where it happens. If you're scientists, you'll be able to know exactly where deforestation and the impact it's having. So these are exciting days. So that's the first example. Second example is food. Well, what's wrong with the food system? Well, in many ways, nothing, because farmers have done an amazing job feeding us. We've doubled our population since 1970, but actually, at the same time, we are better nourished, and they've kept up with that. So well done, the farming community. The problem is that by 2050, we need to increase food consumption by another 50%. And no longer do we have the luxury of what we've done before, which is taking more land, using more water, and using more chemicals. So we have to think differently. Now, I want to introduce you to the second most polluting species on the planet. Here he is. Humans are the first, of course, but cows are the second. Livestock accounts for 80% of all agricultural land. These animals are responsible for the loss of the Amazon at the moment because they're encroaching into it, and because that's where you grow soy, you cut down the Amazon rainforest, and so on. It turns out also that food is responsible for 1/3 of all of the greenhouse gas emissions, and half of all that comes from cattle and other ruminants. So 15% of all the greenhouse gases come from this fellow here. So what do we do, and what's it got to do with AI? Well, one thing that we're doing, and others are too, we're trying to reduce methane emissions, which are a very, very dangerous greenhouse gas, and that means you've got to do some very sophisticated science relating to the stomachs of these animals, and there are vaccines and there are various other feedstocks that you can work on. AI can help that. Another thing you can do is to think about shifting diets. It's not so much that we want to turn people into vegetarians. The problem is that the rest of the world is getting a real taste for beef, and under current trends, beef consumption will rise by 70% by 2050. If that happens, then goodbye to the rainforests, because we'll need that land. And so moving towards sort of different styles of food for us is quite important. Let me show you this. This is such an interesting picture. See, 10,000 BC. See that tiny little dot down on the bottom left-hand side? That's the number of people. There were 1 million people living in the world then. Come across to today, look at the number of people, 8 billion people. If you were to take all of the mammals in the world on land and weigh them, this is what it looks like now. Look how many wild animals now you see in today. Can you see that? Very small. Look at where the big mass is farmed animals. Do you know that if you took all of the mammals in the world, only and weighed them, only 4% of that weight would be wild animals now. 96% would be farmed animals and human beings. So you can see how we're sort of encroaching upon God's creation. And so one of the things that AI can play a very big role on is what we call sustainable proteins. That could be plant-based, could be fermented, can be lab-grown. Now, lab-grown is sort of maybe the scariest one. Lab-grown is when you eat a chicken, a real chicken, but without killing the chicken. You take the DNA and you multiply it up in a laboratory. So how do you feel about that? Who thinks that's a good idea? Well, that's good. Who thinks it's a scary idea? Yeah, I thought there'd be more. Who thinks it's sort of a disgusting idea? You're right. So we've got work to do. This is a societal choice. This is not to result actually in less beef being eaten than today. It's to stop the massive growth of beef. Why do you need AI? Because there are 200 million proteins, possibly up to 1 trillion. The human body has 100,000 proteins in it. Getting the right taste, the right texture at a low price requires an ability to get the right combination of protein. So it's very exciting. So whether it's going to be a burger or whether it's going to be chicken or, sushi. Sushi, 20 years from now, there will be sushi that you cannot tell the difference of. And it'll be real sushi. But it won't kill the salmon. So there you go. Now the final thing, so I said there'd be 3 examples. The third example is smart electricity grids. Why does this matter? Well, because the grid is what takes the power, hopefully renewable power, and delivers it. In the old days, it was very simple. You had great big power plants, and then you distributed the energy simply to houses and to factories. One way flow. Now it's totally different. Now there will be tens of millions of individual instruments that will be monitoring, and houses will not only be taking electricity in, they'll be feeding it back. Your electric car will take electricity off the grid when it's cheap and plentiful and put it back into the grid when it's needed. You need incredible sophistication. Take a country like, say, Vietnam. Vietnam is very good at coal-powered plants. But at the same time, it's invested a lot in renewable energy. Only half of that energy has access to the grid because the grid just isn't smart enough to absorb it. AI can manage these massively complex systems. And by the way, it can also predict things. You might wonder, what's this got to do with it? What does a fire have to do with it? Well, this is the famous campfire that was caused by an inability to know when there was a risk, and it was caused by electricity wires. AI will be able to predict, will be able to monitor, will be able to shut off and put on and redirect in an amazing way. So look, in conclusion, the transition before us is profoundly difficult. We're going to have to go through a transition bigger perhaps than human society has gone in. But it's also profoundly exciting, and it's profoundly inspiring. There'll be more places like Chautauqua. The world will be greener. We'll stop designing cities for automobiles and start designing cities for people. How about that? So it's very exciting. Yeah. So it's happened before. You may have seen these pictures before. This is Fifth Avenue, New York in 1900. Can you see any automobiles in that? Well, if you look very carefully, there are two. But 95% of the vehicles are horse-driven. So that's 1900. 1913, the same street. Can you see any horses? No. That's how quickly change can take place. And yes, we worried about losing the horses. That was a shame. But they were able to retire happily. Not all transitions are easy. And this won't be easy. Tomorrow, we're going to have my good friend, Jamie Metzel. I don't know if he's here. He's going to be speaking on this stage tomorrow. Just written a brilliant book. If you can get Amazon to deliver it tonight, read it before tomorrow. He's going to be looking at opportunities and risks in a really remarkable way. I want to close by thanking Chautauqua. I was struck this morning in the service here how you do something that is really wonderful. You bring great minds, inquiring hearts, and a sense of faith. You don't need to be any particular religion, but you actually do need to. We are motivated, aren't we? And I'm really struck as we think. One of the things that I ask myself when I wake up on a Monday morning, what is it that sort of motivates me? It's actually not so much the economics. I happen to be an economist. It is the fact that God gave us a world, and it was very good. That means something. We want to protect that world. He also gave us the first commandment, which is not in Exodus chapter 20. It's at the very beginning of Genesis. And it says, look, this is my garden, be a good steward. He also gave us the first messenger. If you go to Psalm chapter 19, it says the heavens declare the glory of God. But if you can't see the heavens, how can they declare? And it also sort of has a lot of teaching on enough is enough. There's that beautiful piece in Ezekiel where God says, is it not enough that you have the green pasture? Must you trample it with your feet? Is it not enough to have the pure water? Must you muddy it with your feet? And that's how we should be living our lives. And that's why we should be looking for every possibility of new tools like AI to try and solve the problems. Now, I want to do an experiment now. I want you all to stand and to sing. But it worries me because I've got a microphone on, so you'll hear me more than you. So why don't we, it's the 4th of July, Oh, beautiful for spacious skies. Okay. Oh, beautiful for spacious skies, for amber waves of grain, for purple mountains' majesty, above the fruited plain. America, America, God shed his grace on thee, and crown thy good with brotherhood, for sea to shining sea. Well done. So on this 4th of July, let's learn from these guys. Think boldly, think bravely, take risks, have inspiring thoughts that will change the world. Thank you very much. Thank you.
So Chautauqua, we are not ending this early going into Q&A. We're actually going to have a little bit of a conversation together, and then we will indeed open up our traditional Q&A. Sir Andrew asked backstage, and I don't know if you ever get tired of hearing Sir Andrew, so I'm just going to pepper that in there from time to time, whether we could get you to sing, and I assured him we could, so thank you. Thank you for that. And you sounded lovely. And with all due respect to Mr. Bezos, you can also get that book in our own bookstore. You don't have to order it. You can just go right down there and get it. You know, we kind of don't want to get you in trouble, but, you know, old-fashioned walking community. Thank you so much for such an enlightening focus on how AI might think about what's happening with climate change. But I also know that the Bezos Earth Fund does lots more. And so I'm wondering if you could just share with our audience a little bit about why was it created, what does it do, what are you trying to accomplish? Just give us kind of a macro picture of what is this amazing organization that you've been tasked with running?
Well, one of the wonderful things about this country, and I think sometimes those that come from other countries notice it more, is how wealthy people give back. And I'm sure that includes some people in this room. There's a level of generosity in this country which is unsurpassed. And so I think what Jeff Bezos said, look, there's so much gloom, isn't there? The environmental messages are sort of so gloomy. We're losing species at 1,000 times the natural rate. We're losing tropical forests the size of Portugal every year. Climate change is pushing us over a precipice. And actually, that's all true, and there is a better way. There is a better way. We do not need to sacrifice our efforts to reduce poverty. We do not need to sacrifice our efforts to become more competitive, to have better jobs, to enjoy higher incomes. We don't need to sacrifice that. There are ways of having a much smaller footprint whilst a much greater degree of human well-being. And so what we did, and so he put $10 billion on the table, and to be spent this decade. He said, I don't want a foundation that will last 100 years. This is the decisive decade, so let's get on with it. So we, for example, have allocated $3 billion to nature, and $1 billion to conserve what we still have, the nature that's still pristine. $1 billion to restore nature we've lost. You know, 60% of the soils in Africa are degraded. And $1 billion then to reform food systems. And if you don't reform food systems, as I was saying before, then you're not going to be able to conserve nature or to protect nature. So that's, if you like, our nature portfolio. But then we invest a lot on monitoring satellite systems that enable us to know things that we need to know if we want to make a decision. Lisbeth and I lived 5 years in Indonesia, and recently talking to the president of Indonesia, when we showed him what he could now know, he said, for the first time ever, I now will know whether my policies to protect forests in the middle of Borneo, whether they're actually working. Because otherwise I have to send a team and it takes them a month, a week to get there. And we can't afford to do that all the time. So what we know, what we measure, we will treasure. And what we treasure, we will manage. And so we invest a lot in that. And then we invest in, for example, nice project we do that's very important. There are 480,000 school buses in this country. 500,000 school buses in America. They're all diesel. And if you, as you know, education in this country is county-based. So if you are from a poor family in a poor county, the child goes to school on a bus, breathing air from the fumes because the county can't afford to buy new buses. It can't afford really even to manage its existing ones well. And these kids are breathing air equivalent to what they'd breathe on the streets of New Delhi, for example. So, but you could electrify them. And it turns out that actually 96% of all the electric buses in the world are made in China. Wouldn't it be cool if we created a US electric bus system? So what we're doing is, we're investing heavily, working with Congress, who put some resources in, working with the private sector, working with states. State of New York was the first one to pass legislation saying we're going to electrify our school buses. And the great thing, yeah, well done, New York. And the great thing about it is, it also is a sort of intergenerational thing. So kids start going to school in an electric bus, you link that to their education, and they start talking about not climate change, because it's really, no, talking about clean technology and reduced pulmonary. And so that's the sort of thing we do. And then one final thing it does to illustrate how, if you think these things through, you think about those 500,000 electric buses, all those long summer months just sitting there. Isn't that a waste? Well, no, because that's 500,000 big batteries that take electricity off the grid when there's plentiful, it's not needed, and then they put it back on the grid, and that will save you building 10 new power plants. So that's a sort of example of how we try and look at an issue. We are monitoring 50 transitions that the world needs to go through this decade and the next. And we ask each one, how close are they to a positive tipping point? A positive tipping point beyond which change becomes irresistible and unstoppable. And then we ask, what would it take? What are the barriers that we could help investing? So that's the sort of thing we do.
So Mr. Bezos is a great example of someone doing this at a very, very large scale. And we had a conversation yesterday about the role of philanthropy in this country. And we were talking a little bit about how that's different in other parts of the world. And I was just in Paris for a roundtable on philanthropy with US philanthropists and European philanthropists. And one of the things that they said was, when governments fail, your philanthropic community can step in. We don't have the same system. And we're starting to see several elections in Europe in particular where folks are saying do less from a government base, do less from a government base. Do you think philanthropy will catch on in a greater way in other parts of the country, or is that something that is primarily focused here? How do we think about using philanthropy globally for these issues?
Well, the very fact that meeting happened is a sign of what's happening. There's no question that just as in many, many other areas, the rest of the world, lags the United States. I mean, philanthropy now in Europe is becoming quite robust. Still nowhere near what it is in the United States. But for example, the largest foundation in the world will become, I guess the Gates Foundation is now the largest, Novo Nordisk. Novo Nordisk is a drug company, as you know, and its entire ownership structure is owned by its foundation. And the money's going to go directly, and IKEA is similar. So you have these big corporates who actually are not owned. There aren't really any shareholders of IKEA. The money goes into a foundation. So there's some pretty exciting things. I think even more exciting is what's happening in Asia, which traditionally has had a very personalized philanthropy. So if you go to India, a lot of the schools or hospitals have been built by individual philanthropists. Now for the first time, they're sort of getting together, and it's sort of a bit of a movement, and it's quite exciting, actually. But, I mean, the whole idea of Andrew Carnegie's philosophy, make money in order to give it away, is not intuitive yet to most rich people.
So you gave us some examples, and of course this is the week that we're talking about the AI revolution. How are you using, from an organizational standpoint, how are you using AI in your organization's work, and how is it helping you come up to scale more rapidly on some things, if at all?
Well, I would say it helps us identify, for example, geographies where we want to work. So we can't cover the whole world. We want to focus certain geographies and then sort of demonstrate success, and hopefully it will scale up. So we're using it in that regard. We don't have, we're a large We're a large fund in terms of our money. We're not huge in terms of staff. We like to learn from others, so we would get the best academics to help us. So we're allocating funds at the moment. We're about to launch a new fund on what's called greenhouse gas removals. At the moment, there's obviously a lot of greenhouse gases up there. We invest a lot in bringing them down to Earth. So the best way of doing that is in the form of a tree. So photosynthesis is the best way of bringing down carbon dioxide into trees and crops and soils and bushes, where instead of bringing death up there or destruction up there where you cause climate change, you bring it down here and you create life and vitality. We work in this country with something called NIFWIF, the National Fish and Wildlife Federation, which is a wonderful organization that distributes funds to frontline farm groups and other groups that actually basically invest in photosynthesis, bringing down carbon dioxide into the soil where it's most necessary. You know, some people say that, well, the farm community is not really interested in climate change, but actually it's the farm community that needs the carbon. There's one phrase I hate, which people say, oh, we've got to go zero carbon. I say, no, we want more carbon, but we want it in the right place. We want it in trees, we want it in soils, and we want it in crops. We don't necessarily want it up there, sort of thing. So back to your question, we would use sort of quite sophisticated technology to identify where in Africa we're going to put resources to bring down those carbon dioxide molecules so that farm yields will double and the yields will become more resilient. And the soil will be able to manage water better. That requires actually a lot of analysis.
You mentioned an election happening, of course, in the UK today. We might have one coming in a few months here that we've been talking a little bit about. And so often when we talk about climate change or climate justice or fill in whatever words you want, in this country we tend to try to quickly silo that into a left, right, Republican, Democrat, fill in whatever barriers you want. You were saying yesterday that you actually think there's a bipartisan way to be thinking about these issues. And I wondered if you could share a little bit about that and where you've perhaps worked with some characters we might think as unlikely allies in this work.
Well, one of the wonderful things about nature conservation in this country is that it spans the green is, and then the sort of Teddy Roosevelt environmentalists. In other words, the Republican Party loves nature, and bless them. I mean, they should, and we all do. I mean, whether we're Republican or Democrat. And so what we're finding actually in the Congress, if you don't enter the door through climate change, but enter it through either nature or competitiveness. I mean, the example of green technology and electric buses, for example, who's not in favor of that sort of thing? And so, yeah, we actually believe that whilst things are becoming very easily politicized, it doesn't need to be. I mean, one of the sort of striking things in other countries, I mean, in the UK, the great champion of climate change was Margaret Thatcher, who was the most conservative prime minister we've had, for 100 years. And because she said, for heaven's sake, I mean, this is clearly not a good thing to be doing this. Why don't we figure out that actually our economy can thrive and we will address that? And it is a puzzle. I mean, we're not political at all. But I mean, it's a sort of a puzzle. All energy comes from the sun, all of it. So that if you think of it like this, there's two ways of using energy. You can have energy come and create trees and forests, and let those forests die, and then wait 65 million years, whilst gradually that gets covered with, and then you pump it out the ground in the form of oil or gas or coal. Or you could take energy today from the sun and save 65 million years. So But what does that have to do with politics? It's not entirely clear to me, but it does.
Yeah, you were saying yesterday, I was struck by this, and it really underscored that point, some of the conversations and work you're doing with Lindsey Graham.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, exactly right.
Yeah.
So Senator Lindsey Graham is, we're working with him and with other Republicans and other Democratic senators to put together a fund for international conservation, and deeply committed. And also very committed to the food agenda, by the way. I mean, really, really exciting stuff, I think. So, yeah, I mean, I think we certainly live in hope. I mean, the need is great.
Yeah.
It is God's creation. Surely we all want to protect it.
Yeah. Well, that's a perfect segue before we turn it over to our audience for questions, because you interweave in your presentation and reference often God's creation. And I wondered if you could just share with us your perspectives on what's the role of faith in this entire conversation around climate change, and how might we think about mobilizing faith communities in this effort?
So I'm an economist, and so economists tend to think if you want behavior to be changed, you tax bad things and you subsidize good things, you know. And yeah, that does work sometimes. But actually the reason that people do things is because of what they believe. The reason you recycle or don't recycle is because of who you are as a person, not because of what some government tells you to do. And so faith does matter. Faith influences, I'm sure, many, if not most of the people here. It doesn't necessarily even need to be religious, you know, faith. But it is what you believe. And every major religion that we're aware of in its holy writings talks about the goodness of creation and the need to protect nature, but also to protect the poor. And so it's obviously disappointing sometimes when there might be distortions of certain, you know, passages of scripture and so on. So yeah, we believe there's quite a lot of, and it's very interesting things going on in this country right now. We're working with some evangelical groups who are committed to science, and you know, there's a new generation of young evangelicals at some of the Christian colleges that are saying, well, actually, maybe we should reread the scriptures a little bit on this. So yeah, we do believe that that there is a wonderful potential here. The problem, of course, is that we've got to move quickly. We're heading towards real danger, and you can't really change an entire generation quickly enough in order to get to where you need to get to.